So from the previous lecture, right, we had kind of finished up looking at a slide that looked something kind of like this, and as I had mentioned, right, the whole basis, the entire idea behind digestion is to get the large molecule that you put inside of your mouth, so the food, whatever it happens to be, to get it small enough where it actually can fit through the intestinal wall. Right, so I kind of use the analogy, the example of taking that block of ice and breaking it down to smaller and smaller components so it can fit through that screen. Right, so to this point we talked about the mouth, right, and the oral cavity and the salivary glands, and we talked about the stomach and all of the different, hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen, all those different secretions. We're going to start to get into the intestines, right? Specifically, this first part of the intestines called the duodenum, right? The duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. This is really where the bulk of digestion and absorption is going to occur, even with as much digestion that's occurred to this point, right? Through the salivary glands, through the stomach, the vast majority, 80-ish%, right, of the digestion and absorption is going to occur in the small intestine, specifically the duodenum. I mean, we see because of that, or essentially one of the reasons for that is because of the contribution from the pancreas as well as the gallbladder. Where you can see, right, a major site of input from the gallbladder and the pancreas is right here in the duodenum. We can see these, right, this would be the liver up and through here. Right, we can see this ductwork, which feeds into the duodenum. You see this ductwork, which feeds into the duodenum. Yeah, this right here is called the hepatopancreatic duct. It's essentially where the common bile duct and the pancreatic duct combine. They combine so they can then dump into the duodenum. So one of the first things that has to happen, right, is remember the chyme, right, the acidic slurry of food that's in the stomach. It's no longer called food, it's called chyme. Once that dumps down into the duodenum, right, this acidic slurry, again, this is highly, highly acidic. The duodenum, or even just the intestines themselves, they're very delicate tissue. Right, so we have to have some sort of way to counteract this acidity. And we do. Right, there's a couple different ways. We can see something called sodium bicarbonate. You've seen baking soda, right? Literally sodium bicarbonate, right? It's a base. Remember the little pH scale, 1 to 14, right? 1 to 7 is an acid, 7 is neutral, above 7 is a base, right? So the acidity of the stomach acid can be buffered or kind of counteracted by the sodium bicarbonate, and that sodium bicarbonate is released by both the pancreas as well as the gallbladder. And again, as I had pointed out a second ago, this duct, right in here, right, the hepatopancreatic duct, that's where the common bile duct and that's where the pancreatic duct, they secrete the sodium bicarbonate in those common bile duct, and the pancreatic duct combine into the hepatopancreatic duct. From there, it feeds directly into the duodenum. Because think of it, the intestine, right, the duodenum being very kind of delicate tissue, just the same way as in the stomach. Right? The stomach produced huge amounts of mucus. That mucus helped to kind of buffer or line the stomach. Therefore, the stomach acid and the different enzymes didn't begin to break down the stomach tissue. Same exact thing is present in the duodenum. There are things called Brunner's glands or duodenal glands. They produce a huge amount of mucus to help buffer or to help protect the duodenum from all of the chyme, that acidic slurry of food. Right? Duodenal ulcers, same idea, whereas in the stomach with the gastric ulcers, how there's an insufficient production of mucus in a particular area, so therefore the stomach acid comes into contact with the stomach tissue and it's painful. Same idea with these duodenal ulcers. If there's insufficient production of mucus, nothing protects the duodenal wall in that area where there's the lack of mucus, and that acidic kind comes into contact with the wall, and it's immensely painful. Right? So some other things, right? It's not only the fact that the pancreas and the gallbladder produce sodium bicarbonate. Some other things that they're going to produce. The pancreas. The pancreas is going to produce digestive enzymes, and a boatload of them. Right? Lipase, amylase, trypsin. Lipase is an enzyme which is going to digest fats or lipids. Right? Amylase digests carbohydrates. Trypsin digests proteins. Right? Before this, there was lingual lipase, right? Meaning within the saliva there was an enzyme which began to break down lipids in the mouth. There was gastric lipase, which began to break lipids down in the stomach. Right? In the saliva, there was also salivary amylase. Right? There was amylase contained in the saliva, which began to break down carbohydrates. In the stomach, right, the production of hydrochloric acid, or the production of pepsin, the production of pepsinogen, which then led to the production of pepsin, that began to break down proteins. It's a kind of multi-tiered step, right? As the mouth breaks down lipids, as the mouth breaks down starches, it doesn't break them down entirely. It begins the breakdown process. Then it moves to the stomach. The stomach furthers that breakdown process. Then, once it gets to the duodenum, or to the intestines, that's where you start to have the vast majority of digestion occur, because the particles of food are small enough that the chemical, right, the enzyme, can come into contact with the majority of the food particles. Remember how I had mentioned at the end of the previous presentation that the only way enzymes, the only way these chemicals can have, or the only reason they can break down food, for instance, is if they come into contact with it. That's it's one of the importances of the tongue, right, or one of the important features of the tongue, is the tongue moves the food around in your mouth so we can mix as much of that saliva with as much of that food as possible. Right, so as the food breaks down, which again begins with mechanical digestion in the mouth, because we have to increase the surface area of the food. As we increase the surface area, more chemicals, more enzymes can come into contact with that food. Now, one of the other things, right, that we're going to see as far as the gallbladder, right? The gallbladder secretes sodium bicarbonate, right, just like we talked about, but something else, right? The gallbladder is also going to secrete something called bile. We see bile salts are secreted into the liver. No, my goodness. We're starting like that. All right, bile salts are secreted into the duodenum, right? The gallbladder merely stores the bile, right? The liver is what actually produces the bile, right? Not the gallbladder. So let's kind of backtrack and think about that for a second. The bile is produced in the liver. Its function is to emulsify fats, right? To essentially break down fats. So I'm just going to pose a question for 10 seconds and let you think about it. Why is it that the liver, not so much why is it the liver specifically produces bile, but why is it we have this storage site of bile? So go ahead and take about 10 seconds to think about that. So, think about food, right? We have different foods have different amounts of fat, right? Hop down to Five Guys. I talk about Five Guys all the time. It's my crutch. At least it was my crutch. This whole current stay-at-home order. But anyways, right. Think of whatever fatty food, cheeseburger, french fries, milkshake, right? It doesn't have to just be that, but some high-fat containing food. We need to have a significant amount of bile present in order to break down that amount of fat sufficiently. Contrast that to a kale salad, right? Which I, probably wouldn't ever in my life even consider consuming, right? But kale salad, right, has a minimal amount of fat, right? From the kale, has none. But let's say it's whatever, kale, some cranberries, some sliced almonds, whatever, right? The point is, not all meals have the same fat content. So we have to have the ability to store the bile. Therefore, when we consume as a sufficient or a sizable quantity of fat, we can have a significant enough release of the bile. Here's the pancreas, right? We can see this duct right through here, which we already looked at a little while ago, right? This is the pancreatic duct, right? In the endocrine system, we looked at the pancreas as well, right? The pancreas has both endocrine and exocrine function, right? The endocrine hormones, insulin, glucagon, those we looked at, right? We already looked at those. Here we're going to focus on the digestive portion of the pancreas. All right, all these different pancreatic acini, right? Outside of this structure here, right? This is the islet of Langerhans. That corresponds to the endocrine portion of the pancreas. But everything else outside of that, all of these kind of deep lavender in color, right? All this out here, that's all pancreatic acini. The pancreatic acini, those are the structures which are going to secrete the trypsin, which are going to secrete the amylase, which are going to secrete the lipase, right? Those are the structures, the pancreatic acini. So the way that it works, right? They produce the digestive enzymes. Those digestive enzymes then dump into the pancreatic duct. From the pancreatic duct, they then travel all the way down into the duodenum, right? And therefore, once they're dumped into the duodenum, they can then begin to digest the carbohydrates or the proteins or the lipids, whatever enzyme it happens to be. Right. One of the things which is going to help stimulate this release, just like in the stomach, right? Going back to the last presentation. Just like we had in the stomach, distension of the stomach caused the release of gastrin. Remember, gastrin was a hormone which functioned to increase gastric motility and helped to increase gastric secretion, and it also helped to stimulate the eventual production of these digestive enzymes from the pancreas. In the duodenum, kind of the very similar functions are going to occur. When food enters into, or when the chyme enters into the duodenum, it's going to distend. Right. As it distends, or as it stretches, that's going to stimulate the release of a hormone called secretin, as well as a hormone called CCK, or something called cholecystokinin. Right. Those are the two hormones which really stimulate the release of bicarbonate ion, as well as these digestive enzymes. Right. Last presentation, we're talking about the stomach. All right. How is the stomach new to release hydrochloric acid? How is it the stomach knew to release pepsin and pepsinogen? It had to do with distension of the stomach. As it distended, gastrin was released. Same thing in the duodenum. When that food enters into the duodenum stretches. That then further stimulates sodium bicarbonate as well as those digestive enzymes. When we look at the enzymes in through here, when we think about something called pancreatitis, right? Pancreatitis, right? Kind of textbook when we think about where the pain, right, where the issues are. There's different reasons. There's acute pancreatitis, chronic pancreatitis. We're just going to kind of talk about acute pancreatitis for a moment. Chronic pancreatitis we'll talk about later. I don't think we'll get to it today. But with acute pancreatitis, essentially what happens is the pancreas starts to try to digest itself. Right? Think of it this way. You have a cut on your hand. Right? You dump lemon juice on it. All right, that lemon juice has a pH of around 5.5, right? It's immensely painful. Now think of that occurring inside of your pancreas, right? I realize it's not stomach acid, but from the standpoint that those digestive enzymes begin to break down tissues, right? Trypsin breaks down proteins. Lipase breaks down lipids. Amylase breaks down carbohydrates. So what happens in pancreatitis is you actually have the premature activation of these different enzymes. And when that happens, that begins to break down. And think of it as kind of almost eating away at the pancreas. And yeah, that is immensely painful. Where people have pancreatitis, again, the pain is kind of described like right in the epigastric region, right? Pain is significantly provoked by eating. Right, lying down is significantly painful as well. Right, some the relief they can receive, or kind of the position that they might find the most comfort in, is imagine kind of standing up in front of a desk and kind of bending forward a little bit. Right, that's generally where they're going to find the most comfort to alleviate some of the pain that they're having. The liver. Right, we talked about the gallbladder, talked about the pancreas. The next organ that we're going to talk about, which contributes to the GI tract, or contributes to digestion and absorption, is the liver. Now, the liver is hugely important when we talk about just bodily function. You can see the liver performs in an estimate of around 500 different functions inside of the body. Some of the larger ones: hormonal regulation, right, whether it's the production of hormones or the breaking down of hormones. Blood glucose control. Yeah, remember how I mentioned our the food that we consume, right? Doesn't matter whether it's a protein, whether it's a carbohydrate, small chain fatty acids, large chain fatty acids. We'll talk more about this in metabolism and nutrition. But 90% of what you put inside of your mouth, 90% of what you absorb, the first place it goes to in the body, once it's absorbed into the bloodstream, is to the liver. That's why, and the reason why that is because your liver is the ultimate adjuster of the blood composition. Meaning, if I just ate a giant bowl of pasta, alright, I would have a tremendous influx of glucose in the blood. The liver's responsibility is to begin to store that glucose, either in the form of glycogen or convert it so eventually it gets stored as adipose tissue or fat tissue. That's the liver's responsibility. Same thing with protein levels. Same thing with fatty acid levels. Right? Same thing with the synthesis of cholesterol, bile production. These are just some of the things that the liver is involved with. Right? We see jaundice, cirrhosis. Yeah, in the urinary system, when we get there, we're going to learn about how important proteins are in regulating fluid volume. For instance, if somebody has edema or a tremendous amount of swelling, the reason, let's say if someone has some sort of renal impairment, renal condition, the reason why they become edematous is because the kidneys can no longer regulate protein levels, whether they are or aren't in the urine. When we get to the urinary system, we'll talk about that. My point now is that the liver is responsible for producing those proteins. Right? And again, it's those proteins which help dictate whether the fluid is within the blood vessel or whether that fluid is outside of the blood vessel. Right? Remember, if the fluid is outside of the blood vessel, if it's in the interstitial fluid and it begins to accumulate, that's where the person becomes edematous. Right? They start to look kind of swollen. So, different conditions, right? We see cirrhosis, jaundice. Jaundice is something. There's different things can cause it. Liver failure, right? Fatty liver disease, right? Whether it's alcoholic or non-alcoholic. Even in infancy, right? Jaundice is something that is incredibly common in young boys, right? In infancy. Jaundice arises from the excess or the accumulation of something called bilirubin, right? It's very common because upon birth, right, the liver takes on a huge number of functions. Tremendous, right? I mean, as I mentioned, right, that we know of. There's around 500 different functions that the liver performs. So, upon first being born, the liver has to kind of mature. So as that happens, the first few days, Junior, my son even, right, he was very kind of yellowish when he was born. Not so much the standpoint that it was of any concern, right, and generally it's not much of a concern. If it starts to be prolonged, if there starts to be significant, deterioration, or if there starts to be significant problems with the liver, sure, they can put Junior under UV lights, and that actually begins to break down the bilirubin itself. The end, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's where, again, that bilirubin, that's one of the proteins that the liver is going to produce. So if there's issues in the production of it or the breakdown of it, that's where it begins to accumulate. So the first thing we're going to look at as far as the process of the liver as far as production sake. We talked about how the liver produces bile, right? It's stored in the gallbladder. Right? It's stored in the gallbladder, but it's produced in the liver. And you can see the liver produces around 600 milligrams of bile daily. Right? So the functions, emulsify fats, right? Again, it's just one of the steps in the production of bile, one of the steps in the breakdown of fats. Right? Get rid of waste products. Yeah, bilirubin. Hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin in and of itself is not a waste product, but red blood cells, if you remember, only have a lifespan of around 120-ish days. As much of the hemoglobin is, recycled as possible, but some of the protein portion of it is, eliminated through the waste, through the stool. Same thing with bilirubin, right? It is we have to be able to regulate the levels of protein. So one of the ways we can do that is to eliminate it through the bile. You can see excess accumulation of cholesterol, right? The bile production, or our liver produces around 600 milligrams of bile daily. One of the other functions of bile production is bile helps to eliminate excess cholesterol. Right? You can see to the tune of the fact that the liver produces around 600 milligrams of bile daily. Of that 600 milligrams, 500 milligrams of it is cholesterol. Right, so that's something else that our liver has a tremendous ability to do, is to eliminate the bile. Or is to eliminate the cholesterol through the bile. And that coincides with, right, triglycerides or fatty acids, right, cannot leave the liver. If they remain in the form of triglycerides, they are not able to leave the liver. The only way for them to leave the liver is in the form of cholesterol. So one of the ways that your liver can eliminate the triglycerides is to convert it into cholesterol, because we can see, again, that's where the cholesterol then travels to, down to the gallbladder within the bile. So again, your liver has a tremendous ability to control cholesterol levels inside of the body, right? So much so, again, a number of months ago, a year ago, right, different nutritional board, regulatory boards at the federal level, right, they kind of removed the upper limit as far as cholesterol intake from the diet. And the reason that stemmed from, or where that came from, is looking at the intake of cholesterol through the diet. Your liver can, let's imagine, today I had just whatever, kale salads all day. That's all I had. No meat of any kind. I would have a 0% intake, or a 0 gram intake of cholesterol. Let's say I was vegan, right? If you're vegan, you're not intaking any cholesterol at all, right? Cholesterol is only found in animal products. That's it. Plants have 0 cholesterol. So if you aren't intaking any sort of, now, that doesn't mean, vegans are running around being cholesterol deficient. Not at all. Their liver can produce cholesterol, and it does produce cholesterol. Same thing with myself. If today, I just had a normal day of eating, right? Let's say I intook whatever. I ingested half of the cholesterol my body needed, so my liver would produce the other 50%. In the same token, let's say tomorrow I ate meat, whatever, bacon, sausage, eggs for the breakfast. Then for lunch I had a steak, and then for dinner I had a bunch of chicken wings. That would be a huge amount of cholesterol intake. So guess what? My liver simply produces less cholesterol for that particular day. Right? So that's all regulated by the liver. So when I had mentioned, right, talking about bile and cholesterol elimination, how is it the bile actually gets into the gallbladder? How is it actually gets eventually down into the gallbladder? Right here's something called the bile duct. There's this thing called the portal triad, portal liver triad. Yeah, three things: the portal vein, the hepatic artery, and the bile duct. Right. Those three things are what make up the portal triad. So how is it bile can get down into the bile duct? Right. Think of this thing, right? This tributary. There's the river out and through here. Let's imagine that the river is the bile duct. Right, so all the bile has to get into the bile duct, just the same way that all of this water, all these little tributaries, has to feed into this large river. Let's imagine the green here are hepatocytes. What happens is the hepatocytes produce the bile, and because of diffusion, because of the ease, we're not going to go into too much detail, but because of the design of the lymphatic system and the design of the bile duct itself, bile has a much greater ability to diffuse into the bile duct, right? Just like if these hepatocytes produce the bile, eventually that bile would all flow down these tributaries, and eventually it would feed into the bile duct. Now, once we get into the bile duct, right, what is the actual course of how our bile then gets into the duodenum? Right, so we can see the common bile duct. Okay, this is what was going to join with the pancreatic duct to eventually feed into the duodenum. Again, these hepatic ducts, those bile ducts we pointed at here, these bile ducts are all going to eventually combine and give rise to these right and left hepatic ducts, where you can see bile ducts feed into the right and left hepatic duct. The hepatic ducts then feed into the common hepatic duct. And then from there, right, that's where you have the ultimate secretion into the duodenum. Now, one of the things that can happen is the formation of gallstones, right? Just like with the kidney, right? Right in the kidney and urinary system, we'll talk about it. Right, the bulk of kidney stones are a byproduct of calcium, right? It's 80-ish% or so. The majority of gallstones are cholesterol-based, which kind of makes sense considering the fact that, my math is horrible, but considering 85-ish% of bile is cholesterol, it makes sense that, right, the majority of gallstones are cholesterol in nature. Right, gallstones can begin to accumulate. Right, they eventually, if enough accumulate, they actually call it, in radiographic terms, they call it a bag of diamonds appearance, where literally it looks like there's a bag of diamonds beneath the liver. And what that is because there are multiple gallstones which are forming inside of the gallbladder. But just like the common bile duct here, just like the cystic duct here, right? A marble is not going to fit through a straw. Doesn't matter what you do. Same idea. Right, if we have little tiny gallstones, or little tiny kind of rocks, quote-unquote rocks of cholesterol, those small rocks are not going to fit through the cystic duct. Since they can't fit through the cystic duct, they then remain in the gallbladder. Right, and just like trying to, like before Sonic closed years ago in my town, they had this fresh banana milkshake, which was unbelievably delicious. Once in a while, a piece of banana would get stuck in the straw, and guess what? I couldn't then actually suck any more milkshake through the straw. Right. Same idea here. Right, if these gallstones block the cystic duct, we then can't release the sufficient amount of bile from the gallbladder. In the same token, the liver, we can no longer we can no longer store adequate levels of bile in the gallbladder, right? Just the same as if bile can't get out of the gallbladder, the same token as bile can't get into the gallbladder. We can still produce bile. Remember, that's produced in the liver. So where's the liver, right, continuously produces bile, right? Bile is just an ongoing production basis, and it has to be because of the fact that that's one of the main ways that our body is going to eliminate cholesterol. In the intestines, these two hormones which I mentioned before, right, secretin and cholecystokinin, these are the two hormones which are going to be released upon distension of the duodenum. Right, when the duodenum distends, these two hormones are released, which then goes and stimulates the pancreas as well as the gallbladder to release sodium bicarbonate or bicarbonate ion, as well as the digestive enzymes. So this next portion, right, we're going to start to get into, right, we've already introduced the duodenum, and from there I kind of sidetracked to the different glands and organs which contribute to digestion. Here is where we are going to start to talk about kind of the composition, the function, the structure of the entirety of the small intestine, right? There's the three portions of the small intestine. There's the duodenum, there's the jejunum, and there's the ileum, right? All three regions have relatively the same makeup, but do have certain unique characteristics, right? By and large, they have the same appearance, right? Just like a house. I mean, overall, they have the general same appearance. You can tell a house is a house, but they definitely have their own features and characteristics which separate them, right? So we're going to look at some of those different characteristics to begin with, right? So here, the presence of villi. When we look at the intestine here, right, we can see intestinal folds, we see villi, we see things called microvilli. Yeah, in the wall of the intestine, we can see all these little finger-like projections sticking up. Right, here's just a little better view of that. Again, just like how we had to break down the food to make sure that we could increase the surface area of the food, because the only way that the enzymes, the digestive enzymes, can have an impact on the food is if they come into contact with it. Same idea here with the intestines. The idea is the only way that the intestines can further digest the food as well as then absorb the food is if those, it's not food at this point, but those partially digested food molecules, the only way they can be absorbed is if they actually come into contact with the intestinal wall. So all of these things which are present, from the intestinal folds to the villi to the microvilli, their entire function is to increase the surface area so we can maximize the amount of absorption which is going to take place. So these little finger-like projections, these little villi on through here, right? Even on the villi are microvilli, right? So on there are thousands of villi, and on the thousands of villi, on each individual villi, there are thousands of what are called microvilli. Right, so there is a huge amount of, there's a huge amount of ability for our intestines to maximize the surface area, and that needs to happen. So, some of the other things. Okay. We see a variety of cells produce intestinal juices, goblet cells, Paneth cells, hormone-secreting cells. Yeah, there's different cells which are going to produce mucus, for instance. Right, all these kind of white air bubbles. Right. For the large part, those are what are called goblet cells. Those produce mucus. Now, different parts of the intestines have different levels of these mucus glands. In the duodenum, for instance, we're going to look at the duodenum has a huge amount of mucus glands, or what are called Brunner's glands or duodenal glands. And the reason why that is because, remember, the chyme, which is that acidic slurry of food from the stomach, that dumps into the duodenum. So there has to be a tremendous way for the duodenum to buffer itself from that acidic chyme.